All right. Good late evening slash night, everybody. It's a Sunday night here in the Bronx, and as you know, this channel is all about systems, matrices, dynamics, and here we have, in the case of Tiffany Henyard, actually a pretty good case study of what can only really be described as a sort of neo proto fascism. We see that it's absolutely a case of corruption, but I'm going to show you exactly how it's fascism specifically. So, without further ado, I'll be presenting some text along with some clips, and we'll see how it all connects. General definition taken from the US Navy, you could see that there's just different types of systems here. In the last videos, I've definitely mentioned how capitalism is specifically the system that we operate on. So we're not just looking at a case of fascism, we're looking at a case of capitalism going into a type of fascism. What I want to point out is at the very top, it says that the ownership has to do with the individual, some sort of concentrated allocation of resources, some sort of allocation of resources, and that's the very fundamental cornerstone of this. That everything was obviously funneled towards her in the way that I showed in the previous. What is a system? You could see how all of the resources were basically um, even stratified, upper, middle, lower classes, but everything under Tiffany Henry's rule was obviously allocated very directly to her and everybody she needed to protect her and keep her system alive within her political system. All right, and this is just to note that, I am going to take into account all types of references, but there are also certain references which are only moot or become sort of moot. So in this case, the Oxford reference specifically talks about Italian fascism, and here the idea of an identity does become important, but only because what we see with Tiffany Henyard is that she co-opted the black community via her being a black female in order to squander any sort of oppositional voices that went up against her. And in the same fashion, Italian fascists or any sort of dictatorial power, because we could even generalize it at that point, would use whatever basis of identity in order to uphold their support. In similar fashion, and in other references that we're going to see later on down the road, you'll see though that the Nazi Party actually downplayed their anti-Semitism at the beginning because it hurt the larger public support that they received. So these are variables that usually the person in center of power is very aware of and that they will still manipulate. So that's at the bottom of this, that's at the subtext of this particular reference. This reference might be talking about Italian fascism, but Tiffany Henry definitely weaponized her blackness against the black community during her term. All right, so I know I'm a very visual learner, and we're talking about something very dynamic. So this is a picture of what I'm talking about. Where in any other government, you're gonna have different distribution of resources, power, etc. There's checks and a balance even. But here you can see everything centralizes to this one thing, fascism. Even going to military, we see with Tiffany, she definitely um, abused her power surrounding the police. And in that way, her police essentially enacted as a paramilitary force. The use of violence to terror, she definitely or allegedly has had hits ordered on dissents of hers. In lieu of extreme nationalism, again, just using her black identity as a way to assuage, anesthetize any sort of dissent coming from the black community. And obviously, it comes by a rule by dictator, which also has its own strict discipline. So, Again, a very fascist type of modus operandi going on here. All right, so this is a graph of the rise of European fascism, and I'm going to make a comparison to the Tiffany Henyard case, which is not going to happen as linear as this graph suggests, although it has all the parts. So I'm actually going to begin here at the end, where it says fascists assume power with broad popular support. She got like an 80% plus vote, so she just had the in. Now we can automatically get to the ideological, where it says feelings of sorry, let me begin. Failure of liberal ideology. So whenever she began failing as an actual mayor, a desire for a transcendent new path. Whenever she was starting to add on her own and push towards her own business types of things, and a feeling of humiliation and victimization, uh, really using her own blackness as a means to equivocate the dissent that she was getting from her own community. Now, if we move towards the political, there was definitely a polarization that happened within the board. The deadlock and paralysis is specifically referring to what happens between the fascists in power and the board or the ministry of the party. Usually there's a tension that happens because the board usually sees what happens. They try to do what they can to stop it, but there's again a deadlock and a paralysis because there's no kind of movement that can happen, and the leftists' refusal to compromise. So there might be a compromise, but there might also be some corruption at such an extent where it doesn't move forward. The economic one, strikes, disorder, recession, insecurity, desperation, kind of speaks for itself. In terms of the military and the police, she definitely, like I had previously stated, basically made a paramilitary force for her police, especially for thinking about it in terms of funding the overtime that they allotted, and that she was kind of bent on having basically her own 24-hour security detail, and she defended those types of claims and beliefs even on camera. So, in a nutshell, she fits this model like very much to a T. So moving on to the next thing. All right. So this next text, I'm gonna cite as what I'm using as a cornerstone for my definition of for fascism. This is a composite uh, brought together by Chuck Anesi that just includes a lot of sources, a lot of philosophers and intellects on their assessment on what is fascism as a historiography, as an actuality, as a type of even like systemic phenomenology. So it's on one hand the it calls upon a repertoire of various types of intellects, and they do have like this motley crew understanding of fascism from various types of sources. So in ways it's very general, but also they offer very specific characteristics of what should be expected in a fascist state or not. Just I would say it's a compilation of various expert opinions and observations and analyses on fascism in various states throughout space and time in history as we know it. All right, so I'm gonna first try to chop this down as best I can, and this is really coming from Robert Paxton, although from this Fascism, the Ultimate Definition. As you can see, Robert Paxton was a professor of history at Columbia University, emeritus professor, and he wrote the book Anatomy of Fascism, published by Alfred A. Knopf, who's actually like that's actually one of my favorite publishing houses. Um, but it says fascism may be defined as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline. All right, so maybe Tiffany's primary modus operandi is this hyper capitalism conflated with her powers. But most certainly, community decline is an impact whether or not that is her intent. I think you could even argue that because of this modus operandi, her hypercapitalism uh, could not have existed or like successfully without first draining from that community, from first declining that community. So it says an obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood. And we see that generally in the sort of like ethos brought about by Henyard. Um, I would say she basically humiliated the board uh, on a very normal basis. She humiliated her own community members who came, even if they were dissenting and even if they were respectful of theirs in their dissent. There was a lot of humiliation and victimhood. Now it says by a compensatory cult of unity, energy, and purity. So this culture, which is getting compensated, which is unified in their own sense, even if it is against that community that they decline. So within fascism, there is one group that is operating that gets compensated by its own means, but it is dependent on the decline of the community. So again, we're in the first sentence, in and just chopping it up, that we're seeing that the first thing that you got to see with fascism is there's already another group within that political party. You already know there's another posse, there's another cult, as they put it here, another crew, right? Who's the clique going on over here? And we see Tiffany Henyard with a lot of her homies. This is the very first definition given by Robert Paxton, again professor emeritus at the history at Columbia University, talking about the anatomy of fascism, and the skeleton is here. So we're gonna move on to the rest. All right, so we're just establishing in fascism. Sure, you're gonna have the political party, but it's gonna be obvious there's a smaller group within that. So it says that group, or that code of unity, in which a mass party of committed national militants working in uneasy but effective collaboration. All right, so basically you have a party, and I say national militants, but I'm going to say the police were very loyal to Tiffany. Everybody who served Tiffany was very loyal to her, and that's the parallel there, because we are talking about a township, so the power is going to be watered down. We're not talking about a whole national takedown of the whole country of like Italy, for example. So it is going to be toned down some. But again, what we saw with the police was nothing less than like a paramilitary force that was very loyal to her. And we saw these goons out there shooting against board members, again, very paramilitary, but loyal towards that one person. And it's saying abandons democratic liberties. So we just saw that across the board, that she abandoned certain democratic liberties. She shut down people's voices. She shut down the board, which was trying to enact checks and balances. There was already a recall for her vote, and there was some technical thing that happened on a court level, and to that I think a magnifying glass should be pointed towards that, because I think that just stinks of corruption considering all of the context. But anyway, she abandoned democratic liberties, even the way she manipulates how the next mayoral candidate would get $25,000 or whatever that figure is. She's abandoning certain democratic liberties, and pursued with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. So here we have again, you know, we we have the paramilitary force, the use of her goons shooting up board members. That is overtly violent. But I'm gonna sensitize the idea of violence, especially institutional violence, when she's manipulating democratic values, and she's basically manipulating the legal structural framework surrounding whoever this new candidate is or whatever law it is. That is also violent. That is extremely violent. That is without any ethics. That's obviously without any sort of legal restraint. A lot of people are asking, where's the IRS? Where's the state? How could the state not be involved after 3 years, right? And uh, thankfully, the board got this in check at the right time, because it says with the goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. So internal cleansing, that would have been the board being left, that they would have been the ones to leave, not Tiffany. Internal cleansing, because at that point she could have filled it in with another board that would have been her echo chamber. You see, it goes in stages, and luckily we didn't see the full fruition of this, but I'm telling you, by this definition, it goes from beginning to end. The groundwork Paxton is laying here. So we're gonna move on forward. All right, so continuing with the definition, it says elements of conflation. So conflation is when two things are made to be confused, made to be mixed up together, and we're going to see what that means exactly. So it says elements deemed essential by all authors who are discussing fascism. All three authors state that statism, nationalism, unity, authoritarianism, and vigor are essential elements of fascism. So what does that mean? Because this sounds good, right? Statism and nationalism, unity, especially. You want an authority figure and someone who's like vigorous, right? So basically, a fascist understands that you need to win the heart of the people, right? And people hold certain values close to the heart. Now, fascists are really slimy in that they're going to manipulate the heart of the people. They're going to have a candidate, whereas a dictator is going to use like straight up force, military force, whatever. A fascist is going to come in with a particular type of charisma or charm that wins over the people, right? And then it devolves after that point. And that's what we saw pretty much with Tiffany. You know, she had the popularism. It was obviously situated in her own township, in her own city, in her own state, contextualized even further within the American dream, even. So she had these sort of elements that granted that individual energy or that zest that really hooked on and latched on to the people. Now, if it says elements deemed non-essential, it says some things that are thought to characterize fascism which do not. Such things include parades. And it says parades and street violence of mass movements. And so I'm going to focus on the parades. Usually with fascists, you do see parades because, again, they manipulate the zeal, the heart of the people itself. It's from a different type of direction, but it's still a manipulation at the bottom line. Now, this is also saying that they also note that the role of anti-Semitism in the rise of fascism movement was minor. And then, of course, there was Mussolini's Jewish mistress in Germany, and anti-Semitism was intentionally downplayed by the Nazis during the ascendant phase because many voters found it offensive. So they're going to be very aware of the mass popular vote and the mass popular sway, and they're not going to put to the forefront things that they know which would affect it negatively. In the same way, Tiffany came in kind of like a Trojan horse, and then at that point, that's whenever there was a lot of dissent. So she again has stole but abused the heart of the people. All right, so moving right along with the definitions of fascisms, here we have how these different philosophers have actually disagreed. So here we're getting this guy named Bosworth, and he's saying that actually, you know, there's going to be two things: charismatic leadership and also the use of violence. So under charismatic leadership, we see that man tends to assign the attribute lesser weight because his analysis includes fascist movements, where charismatic leadership was not an essential element. So there are some people who are saying that they don't necessarily have to be charismatic, but what we do definitely see with Tiffany Henyard is actually kind of both, because at first she was charismatic in terms of really trying to appeal to the people, but then when the dissent became very popularized, she kind of really let her true colors be shown, and then it wasn't even a matter of her charisma or not. She was just letting people know New Jack City is here pretty much. And similar in the ways that she abandoned that sort of charisma is use of violence. So it says, unlike Bosworth and Paxton, a man is a sociologist and takes a more thoughtful approach in analyzing the use of violence. For men, violence is something that states do to maintain order. So they do it with military and police force. We see that with Tiffany Henyard. She definitely, again, militarized her police force, having them over time. But then she also used fake police cars to fake this police type of presence. It's the use of paramilitary violence, not violence per se. So even just that presence itself, although she did have her goons send out shooters to her ops, that man finds to be essential attributes of ascendant fascism. So I really want to point out ascendant fascism. So we are talking about stages of fascism. We're talking about a proto neo fascism whereby it's gonna have all the right ingredients, but it's gonna be cooked in a different type of way or a different type of order. And what we're seeing is like the ascendant phase of fascism, where it begins. Once fascists have control of the state, they tend to enforce the state's monopoly on violence, right? So we saw that Tiffany was really trying to find ways to keep herself in control also. The way she manipulated the future mayor's payroll, definitely a way to manipulate and enforce the state's monopoly and suppress the irregular violence of the squadrizzi, the brown shirts, and anybody who um, is basically on her side. Man has the better argument here, and I would agree with that. So we saw that very overtly with Henyard, and even the way she would weaponize permits. There were several restaurants who said that their permits were denied, and that's another weaponization. That's an extension of this administrative violence. Now here we have the ultimate definition of fascism. Fascism is a form of political and social behavior that arises when the middle class, finding its hopes frustrated by economic instability, coupled with political polarization and deadlock, abandon traditional ideologies and turns. So when you have this middle class that's just so frustrated with all the problems that all the politics bring on, they're seeing there's a polarization. There's people here and there. They're in a deadlock. There's no real solution. After all this, it's what it typically does. It leads that group to abandon traditional ideologies, and in turn, with the approbation of police or military forces, or the poorly defined but emotionally appealing soteriology of national unity, of having, we're just one township, an immediate and direct resolution of problems, and intolerance for dissent. So, what we're seeing is she's really trying to make it so that way anybody who doesn't support her on a board political level, on the level of a business, or even on the level of community organizing, she's just going to try to push y'all guys out. And there you are, just this middle class community who's already frustrated by economic instability, already frustrated by the political things, and that person is using this as a wedge, you see, to really tear everybody apart. And she has the power to manipulate it so that way it becomes so. That's her saying, I'm gonna make it that I'm the only boss here, I'm the only voice here, and she's gonna put her checks and balance like that. All right, next. All right, so moving along with the definitions, we're not gonna go over middle class, but we are gonna focus on the economic instability, polarization, and deadlock, as well as the abandonment of traditional ideologies. So going with the economic instability, I mean, we already know that I think it was like a $10 million swing, pushing Dolton into a deficit, right? So under economic instability, it says economic instability played a prominent role in the rise of fascism wherever it was successful. And I think that we can all just know that whenever you take out the money, when you steal the money, when there's that economic instability, it definitely affects the people. So in Dolton, you had firefighters who couldn't be paid, different things like this. So whenever you have the essential workers who can't even get their money, or some were reporting that their insurances were saying that they weren't getting their payments, it's obviously going to create real world, real time type problems. And that's usually taken advantage of by the fascists. And we'll see how it plays out. Um, So economic instability was more perilous to the middle classes than to the lower classes or the upper classes. A demographic analysis of fascist party membership showed quite clearly that members were, on the whole, younger and better educated than population means, precisely those who would most likely to have their opportunities blocked by economic instability. So again, in this case, and this is like really specific to the type of like Italian fascism, but the takeaway here is the manipulation of an entire economic class, essentially in order to debilitate them and even to know what are their sort of like interests or behaviors, you know. So it's not just to uh, throw a bullet into the heart of the finances, it's also to figure out the sort of like sociological behaviors that come around that. Now, it leads to a polarization and a deadlock. So, what I mentioned before, we saw this polarization and this deadlock. So, first of all, the polarization between Tiffany Henyard and everybody, right? But when we're talking about deadlock in this text, they're speaking specifically a political type of deadlock. And we saw that between Tiffany and the board, that the board was obviously doing the right thing in that they were resisting her, and Tiffany was really adamant about being evil, basically. So, in all cases where fascism was successful, its rise was preceded by a period of political polarization and parliamentary deadlock. So, not even the parliamentary could move in a certain way; they were dead in a deadlock. In Italy, forming a stable parliamentary majority had proved impossible, right? So they couldn't even vote on a particular majority, and making Mussolini prime minister offered a convenient way to break the deadlock. So here, that was their solution. They brought in, here's this guy Mussolini. We know that there's a type of instability already. There's already a type of political unrest, and we're gonna have this guy Mussolini. Little did they know, um, afterward it says, ironically, the failure of leftists to compromise and work with centrists was a major enabler for the rise of fascism in both Italy and Germany. So basically, to put it colloquially, that's really when shit hits the fan. And unfortunately, when we looked at the model of fascism, I said we're going to begin backwards because Tiffany already came in with the popularism. She came in with the populism. She had her facade. She let her true color show, and then shit really hit the fan. Now this is where y'all kind of nipped it in the butt, right where y'all needed to, because getting to the abandonment of traditional ideologies, basically Tiffany and her cronies were holding onto this idea that the board would leave, that the community members would just stop talking, that they would abandon their traditional ideologies. To paraphrase, Thomas Mann, World War I fired the mine beneath the Magic Mountain of pre-war Europe. The Enlightenment heritage of individual rights, progress, and equality collapsed into unprecedented carnage. The war left the victors exhausted and demoralized, the losers angry and resentful, and everyone wondering what went wrong. So again, if she if this investigation didn't happen, if Lightfoot didn't step in, I guarantee you, Tiffany Henry would have only somehow made the shit shittier after she had made it hit the fan. So we see this very clear trajectory happening, and I think that the bud was nipped right when it was supposed to be, right in the bud. All right, so again, moving right along. So here we have approbation of police and military forces. So we saw with Tiffany Henyard, she definitely like paramilitarized a police force. She had her fake police cars out there, and it essentially matches this sort of definition the way that occurred. So it says, if we were to actually skip towards, it says fascists did not seize power through any credible threat of violence. Once in office, they proceeded to consolidate and expand their power through technically legal means. And that's basically like what we saw with Tiffany Henyard. There was, again, a technical legal means of allowing for such overtime to be accrued by those police officers. Obviously, there was a some sort of mechanism to approve of even the existence of that fake police car to exist. Um, I would even say whenever that they had the whole recall against her, and the court found some sort of technical legal loophole, that goes along with this, because what they found was, or what they allowed her to do was to, instead of consolidating and expand her power, to maintain her power through a technical legal means. So we see how that definition just essentially fits what happened during that particular court session. Now, here we have in points F and G, it says that the it says poorly defined, and that fascist ideologies was vague and protean. And here it says it would have slogans like believe, obey, fight, strength through joy, work makes you free. And for this, I would attribute her nonprofits. And I think she was even, I don't quote me on this, but I think that she was even rallying for maybe a cancer organization. I don't quote me on that, but she has most certainly had these types of slogans where it's appealing, leading to the next one, to the emotions of the people. So that leads us right into G, emotionally appealing. It is commonly observed that fascism was more of a matter of the gut than the head. So again, appealing to emotions. It's not a direct physically confrontational conquest. It's more of the stealing the heart of the people, a manipulation of the hearts of the people to win the hearts, but through manipulations. Clearly, those who joined fascist parties often did so from skewed self-interest, but the same could be said of those who joined any party. It was the emotional appeal of fascism, the notion that through the sheer hope and force of will, difficult and long-standing problems could easily be resolved. Right, so that's just an example, but it would definitely offer some sort of overtly more than utopian ideal as opposed to any sort of reality. It's again a manipulation of the heart of the people. Now, we're gonna move on to the next, which is the national unity, but I'm also not really going to focus so much on that one. We just know at the backdrop there wasn't a type of resistance on either like a national township level or like racial level. So that's not something that she necessarily faced. What we see though is her use of a sort of like black nationalism in order to escape any sort of self accountability. Right. So we're gonna move on from there, but we can see that she again lines up with these very clear cut. All right. So this one might seem out of the blue. Now, if we go to um, where it has A, B, C, D, E, we're gonna see this list of things that it just looks like bullshit. It just looks like mess, chicken scratch. Because it says A, shopkeeper sells wine to children. Fascist thug beats up shopkeeper. B, shopkeeper sells wine to children. He has bribed the police and nothing happens. C, shopkeeper sells wine to children. He has bribed the judge and his case is dismissed. D, shopkeeper sells wine to children. The police arrest him and he is promptly fined and imprisoned, which is like the only thing, right? Or E, shopkeeper sells wine to children. He is cited and the case drags on for a year, ultimately disposed of with the plea to a lesser charge or deferred persecution agreement. Now, we got A, B, C, D, and E, right? And only one of those is a real solution. But the point of this is to show what type of decision making would be happening. If beyond Tiffany hitting the initial shit on the initial fan, let's say this investigation never happened, this intervention never happened, and then Tiffany was really able to manipulate the political infrastructures of her particular position of power. What these points are saying, she would have led to such a skewed world that if a shopkeeper sold whine to a kid that he would bribe the police and nothing would happen, or he would bribe the judge and his case was dismissed. Now that's really important because Tiffany actually hired a child predator to do like inspections for like child protective service type things, right? So again, this hypothetical definition within this text, it as chicken scratch as it sounds and looks, right? It actually matches up with Tiffany Henyard. It is so ridiculous. Sometimes you read a bunch of theoretical text and it's like, when am I ever going to see this apply in real life? And here I am looking at this text and thinking that that's what this text was warning about. This text came up with this whole ABCDE of all this chicken scratch crazy sounding shit, but what they're really talking about is the sort of destruction of justice itself, the way we would just see weird shit happen in the form of justice, right? So again, a shopkeeper sells wine to children. He bribed the police and nothing happens. Tiffany Henyard hires a child predator to do children house visit inspections. You see what I'm saying? So the immediate and the direct resolution of problems is going to be skewed because that one authority figure is skewed herself. So I thought that, when I first read this type of definition, I thought it was so random. But it wasn't until seeing Tiffany Henyard's case that I was like, this text is relevant still to this case, even in the moments where I thought it was first chicken scratch. But this is again speaking to the various ways that um, corrupt justice, unjust justice would manifest itself under corrupt rule. It's just things you couldn't necessarily predict. You wouldn't be able to predict the bullshit type shit that they would try to pull off in lieu or in place of justice. Alright, so here it's saying, remember that law is violence and use it sparingly. So when we see that Tiffany has manipulated uh, essentially pervasively all aspects that she really could corrupt, it's nothing short of violent, and it might not be an overt physical use of violence. Although again, she used her goon to try to, equivocate her op. Um, she has also used more nuanced political forms of violence in terms of the manipulation of, again, the use of like mayoral power to change the way a future mayor would be paid, to make taxpayers spend over like $10,000 on billboards for herself. The way she spent like 40,000 on Amazon, the way she did the $10 million swing, all of that is violent. The way she obviously had to manipulate power in order to elect and employ sexual predators is nothing less than violent. The way she blocked out board members, again, very violent. And so here, um, this is just saying that, and it says in the second paragraph, the point here is this: if you think you're better than the fascists because you're passing laws to control people's behaviors in trivial and oppressive ways instead of beating people up, well, you are wrong. The fascists did exactly the same thing. In fact, you are worse than the fascists because you are too cowardly to do the dirty work yourself and want to leave it to the police and the courts. In sum, if you don't have a coherent basis for assessing whether a law is just or unjust, which it practically nobody in any legislator in the United States does, then best to do nothing. So, unless you would be willing personally to use physical violence to enforce a law, knowing that you might be severely injured or killed while doing so, you have no business making such a law and will only bring contempt upon yourself and the legislator if you do so. So, um, again, even the ways that she has manipulated the political terrain, the different types of legislations, the bureaucratic red tape which she must have broken, it's appearing to me it's only going to come under the light of an investigation. So even though a lot of her actions directly impacted the community, whether in direct violent ways or more passive aggressive ways by just not granting certain work permits, um, the manipulation of the legislative infrastructure itself is going to, I hope, be under scrutiny and under review, because I mean, I think any American enemy would just love Tiffany Henyard. Like, oh shit, you just went in there, fucked up the whole township. Like, how did you do it? Like in what, 2 3 years you made them go under 10 million. Wow, like they're out there taking notes. Like she might have like a bubbly personality. I don't know if she was born and raised in the township or whatever, but the damage she's caused is nothing less than what an American enemy would love for anything to happen to, in terms of destruction, to an American city. So here it's saying, just remember, it says amateur commentators on fascism felt to see that fascists did most of their work using the state's monopoly on legitimate violence with nearly universal popular approbation. This included passing laws that controlled the most trivial aspects of human behavior, backed up by the traditional apparatus of police courts and prisons. In many cases, considerable procedure due process existed, most notably. So it's saying that you might have gotten away with it because you're in that position, but it all catches up. It always catches up. So the damage is done. It's done in specific ways, and I hope there's enough of a paper trail to see exactly how, right? But that's what that's saying. This was a part of the text, and I was debating on whether or not to include it, but I thought I would, because this would be a pretty good segue into the board of trustees, and I think that they should be given their due flowers. There was a lot of compromise made, and in these sort of instances where, again, when we saw that, excuse me, the map of fascism, we saw that a part of that mechanism is to intentionally put the board or the ministry at a type of deadlock where there is no movement forward, because that one person has made it their actual agenda to keep it there until it moves the way that they wanted. So in that way, I do want to, give a thank you to the board for holding it down. They had to really maneuver in a very real situation, right? And so here it says compromise requires intellectual honesty, a faculty often lacking on the right and left. It is necessary for the wise to broker compromises and strain every nerve to achieve them. And from the looks of it, it looked like Tiffany was kind of working every nerve. So um, I think that they held it down. They were very graceful. Now, speaking of that, um, I think for those who are looking at this, I think really the big question is what's next? What's the solution? And a lot of people are saying bankruptcy, but first, I'm gonna say Jason House for mayor. I really, really hope that he gets it, because he has been very modular throughout all of this, and he took, that wasn't just grace under fire. That was grace under some extreme fires, extreme grace under extreme fire. I have not seen the man actually like upset. Um, uh, just a few things, and I'll preface this by saying I was a guest lecturer at Cornell and a university professor for over like 20 years, and things like that. But I would recommend maybe assembling um, a think tank which could comprise of whoever it is that you may think it is, and it might be like 5 think tanks. It could be just one. It could be community members. It could be other types of people. What I'm also thinking of is maybe a study on Black Wall Street and the wealth generation that it created. I think would be kind of interesting business model to parallel with Thornton. The third one would be microfinancing. There have been various types of institutions which would fund microfunding, and they're all very different themselves, but they are used to generate wealth um, on a mass level. And I think that the key is gonna be somehow tapping into what generates Dalton's wealth already, and somehow digitally, electronically having this platform to have that open commerce with the world, but in like specific types of ways. Um, and those are kind of like my four um, big I big ideas. I'll say a think tank to really study Black Wall Street and its wealth generation mechanism and how it might be able to be applied to Thornton and Dalton. To maybe to look again into like microfinancing, um, and also uh, some sort of technological or digitalization where it just I just imagine it more as an open platform where the people themselves are just open to those lines of commerce. But I just kind of see that as a basis. I have actually been wondering about this. Um, I have had like dinners with Elias Alcantara when he worked for Obama. He was in charge of all the mayors during Obama's presidency. Um, and I have had like very close conversation with other types of politicals. I almost worked for actually Mark Dayton, but that didn't work out because I got nervous and told him I like working with octogenarians. It was just in bad taste, and I apologize for that. But I thought I would offer at least those 4 cents. So I want to just offer that and say thank you for any time and have a good night.